Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another Video of History Valley podcast. This is the first in-person interview I've ever done on this show. And today we're joined by Professor Jim McGrath, and we're going to be talking a bit about historical Jesus criteria. What criteria do scholars use to understand the historical Jesus? And what can we know about Jesus, or most probably know about Jesus?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say, Jacob, it's great to finally meet you in person and have this
Likewise.
chance to have this conversation. I feel honored to be the first to have this privilege. So I hope you have many more opportunities. It's probably worth mentioning that the occasion of the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature Conference brings together a lot of scholars. And so, yeah, it's a good place to get some of these things done and meet some people in person. We look forward to that too. So, historical Jesus criteria. It's actually something that's really somewhat controversial these days. There have been scholars who have really tried to challenge the notion that we can come up with valid criteria in the way that scholarship has tried in the past. So, anyone who's looked into the subject of the historical Jesus, academic study of Jesus, will have encountered reference to what are called the criteria of authenticity, and mentions things like multiple attestation, the criterion of embarrassment, which means that it's something that didn't fit the agenda of the author, and so they're probably mentioning it because they feel they have to address it, because they don't want to include it in there and would leave it out if they could. And there are a variety of others. Uh, People have sometimes talked about double dissimilarity, where if it's different from the Jewish context, it's different from what the church is emphasizing, then surely it must come from Jesus because it couldn't come from someplace else. And with each of these, there are some problems. And my own view is that it's good and healthy that they've been criticized, but at least some of them, I think, retain some validity because they're just a way of summing up basic historical reasoning that's used more widely in the study of history. When somebody includes something and they seem to be doing damage control in relation to that, it doesn't prove it's historical, but we can be very confident that they didn't invent it. Right? It's something that was already circulating. And if you can find that in an early enough source, then that brings us as close to things that are likely to be historical as we can possibly hope to get when we're dealing with ancient history, where we are entirely dependent on what happened to have survived down to the present time, what people happen to have written, and whenever they chose to start writing about it. Nowadays, if you're doing recent history, if nobody's written about something, you can look for people who may know something about it, and we don't have that option. And so it's easy to forget that we're so dependent on these sources and the sort of whims of history, both what ancient authors chose to do, but also just what has happened to survive to the present day.
Right, because all we have are these texts, and not everything that these texts are telling us is true, and you have to discern between that, and that's where the issue of probability comes in, because depending on the situation, we can't know, and that's the issue. And everybody's debating, having a war of words to try to figure out and try to make sense of these texts. People don't even, often most scholars tend to think that Mark is first, but there's still several of them to hold in Matthew. Some fewer even think Luke is first. So to a degree, there's even disagreement there about the order of the Gospels.
Yeah, they didn't come with dates and indications to provide that, so we have to deduce that. I often make an analogy with the court of law. It can be unhelpful if one thinks of modern criminal cases where you're looking for proof beyond reasonable doubt. That's often too high a standard. I mean, as a rule, that's too high a standard for ancient history, where so much has been lost and no opportunity to cross-examine. In civil cases, you're looking for more probable than not, and that is absolutely what historians are trying to determine. And if we think about sensational cases, everyday cases, most of the time, maybe all the time, we'd have to say we don't know for certain those things that we didn't see. The evidence might be very, very strongly in favor, but sometimes the evidence has seemed very strong in favor of something, and then new evidence has required us to rethink that. Sometimes the evidence hasn't been there to convict someone, but that doesn't mean they're innocent, just means we don't have the evidence. And so oftentimes I think people approach not ancient history in general, but anything to do with Jesus, anything to do with religion, looking for certainty and looking for certainty one way or the other, right? Being able to say, he's just made up, or he's exactly the way I always imagined him and the way I think of him in relation to creeds and things. And the historian may draw a conclusion that's leaning one way or the other but it can only be as a result of painstaking look at every detail and the culmination of studying all of those individually and really asking the critical questions. How strong is the evidence?
Right. And when you look at the synoptic problem and you look at, okay, so Mark came first, as most scholars say. Matthew and Luke are independent of one another, even though that they seem to be very similar in certain circumstances and certain mannerisms. Matthew and Luke copied Mark, so that would be expected. But Luke and Matthew's unique materials are quite different from one another. Yet, even in themselves, they seem to parallel in certain interesting ways, but are yet so different. And the material they have in common, the double tradition material that they do have in common between Matthew and Luke that are largely the same and largely different in certain circumstances, is hypothesized to come from Q. So can you tell us a bit about that, about the Q source, for those that may not know about it? And does it help us understand the historical Jesus at all?
Well, we're always trying to get as close to an individual, an event as possible. And so Matthew and Luke probably writing half a century after these events. That's a significant length of time. And some would push Luke significantly later than that,
Right.
obviously.
Yep.
And all of that is itself uncertain. But there's definitely a passage of time and multiple decades, maybe half a century or more. And so if we detect evidence that something was written down earlier, then that allows us to essentially move closer to the person that we're investigating.
Hmm.
And so from a historian's perspective, that is useful. And so it would be great if we could solve the synoptic problem, but there are competing views. The synoptic problem is just that question of how these three gospels that overlap so much, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, relate to one another. And yeah, so the Q source, I'm still inclined to think that there is such a thing. There is a strong minority. I think it's still the minority, but it's certainly been growing in popularity that says that Luke used Matthew. I think that if one wants to move in that direction, I'm open to being persuaded, and I'm thinking this, sooner or later I'm going to turn my research attention to this question. But sometimes, and this is one of the things that's an argument for Q, sometimes Luke seems to have a version of sayings that seems like it's more original than Matthew's, right? It seems like Matthew has added things to it, has edited it, has expanded, has adapted. And if we don't explain that in terms of a common source that Luke and Matthew used independently, then I think we should say that Luke knew either another written source or oral tradition that sometimes was in a form that was older than the form which we find in Matthew's gospel. And that's the thing that we always have to keep in mind, is that the order in which things are written is just one piece of the puzzle, right? The fact that somebody is writing later than Mark doesn't automatically mean that what they write, if they do something different, is
Wrong.
is their perversion, their twisting of Mark.
Right.
It may be that Mark, the earliest author, actually said, yeah, everybody's saying this, but let me see if I can tell the story this way. And somebody came along next and said, that's not the way I've always heard this, and essentially retroverted it to the form in which they'd always heard it. And so it might be earlier tradition, even though it's later than Mark. And so keeping all of these possibilities in mind, and as we look at each piece of this puzzle, is challenging, but leaves a lot of room for uncertainty, but also for creativity in terms of how we think about these things.
So just to provide a quick example to the audience about this alternating primitivity between Matthew and Luke, it's something like blessed are the poor, like Matthew is blessed are the poor in spirit, Luke has blessed are the poor, but not in spirit.
Yes, and in both of those cases, we can see how that fits with themes in the gospel. And so could Luke have changed it because he has this emphasis on rich and poor? It's possible. Could Matthew have added to it? That's also possible. I'm more inclined to think that Matthew has added those additional phrases, like in spirit, and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness or for justice, because it seems like the thing Matthew does, right? You look at Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer. There's some additional phrases. You look at um, Matthew's version of the material about the destruction of the temple that's found in Mark 13, and Matthew is adding some clarifying phrases and things like that. And so that seems to be Matthew's MO, as it were. And when we see Luke doesn't have those things, then there's reason to think that Luke at least was aware, by whatever means one thinks, right? So whether you think he knew Matthew's gospel or not, he was aware of the fact that Matthew had added something.
When you look at what Luke says in his preface, that he has used a wide variety of sources, could that be and could that be perhaps an obvious explanation about why Luke has a lower verbatim agreement than Matthew does? Matthew has a much higher verbatim agreement with Mark than Luke does. Now Luke is about 70% ish, and Matthew has a 90% ish verbatim agreement with Mark. So could that just be the case that is Luke doing exactly what he says he's doing, that he's using other sources, probably more than Matthew is, and that's probably why he has a larger percentage of disagreement with Mark's wording?
That's a possibility. And of course, we can only speculate when we're dealing with lost sources. Q is not as speculative because we have, it's a deduction based on comparing Matthew and Luke. But what else might Luke have had? That's harder to determine. I wonder whether there's some way we could harness, AI or something to do some, looking at vocabulary. See, are there patterns in how Luke differs from Mark as well as Matthew that could either, indicate that this is just what Luke does with his sources, or that there's this other source, right? Sometimes, the way astronomers can detect a body that we can't actually see by its gravitational pull, could we detect the gravitational pull of another source on
Hmm.
Luke? I think that would be a fascinating thing to explore. I don't know that I'm ever going to get around to doing that, but if somebody else, if somebody else hears this and is like, "Hey, PhD topic, go for it,"
Yeah.
I'll happily, provide encouragement and shout things from the sidelines to spur them on. But it does seem to me that, when he says many have undertaken to write about these things, he must mean more than Matthew and Luke, or Matthew and Mark, or Mark and Q. I do think, having spent the last year working on a John the Baptist project, that a Baptist infancy source or something of that sort probably was also among Luke's sources. And I will be there will be some things in print that go into that in more detail, probably next year.
Hmm. So, as you're just saying, so you think there's some kind of separate John the Baptist source that Luke is using that's not necessarily Q, right? It's a
Right.
separate source.
Yeah. Q
Okay.
has a real interest in John the Baptist. The earliest
Right.
thing that comes from Q, if there was a Q source, is material about John the Baptist. And that's very common in our early Christian sources, right? Mark begins with John the Baptist. Gospel of John goes back to in the beginning was the Word, but the first person to be mentioned is John the Baptist. And Luke says, I'm going to tell you about these important things that have happened, and starts with John the Baptist. So this seems to be the pattern. But I think that the Q source seems to have had an interest in sort of John and Jesus. And I'm not so sure about the infancy material. It may have, right? Because Luke has this doubly focused infancy material. And how much of the Jesus stuff is Luke's addition to Baptist material and weaving Jesus into that? And
Mm.
how much is something that may have been there in the source material is an interesting question. There's an extra canonical gospel known as the Proto-Evangelium of James, or the Infancy Gospel of James. And right at the end, it has what must be a fragment of a Baptist source. Not Baptist in the sense of the modern Christian denomination, but in the sense of John the Baptist movement. Suddenly, the focus shifts away from Jesus and his parents. Herod is looking to kill the children. Jesus' parents hide the baby in a manger to keep him safe,
Hmm.
right? And so there's a weaving together of Matthew and Luke stuff there. But then it says, Elizabeth heard that they were looking for John, and she flees to the wilderness. And
Right.
Herod is interested in John because he's heard that he's going to rule Israel. Like, this is not stuff that Christians would invent, right? They don't think of John as somebody who's going to rule Israel. In fact, they think of
Right.
Jesus as going to rule Israel. And so how that fits into the picture, right? That's getting into the 2nd century, but it's not that far away from these other sources that it's something we should ignore. It's clearly mythologized, but the same can be said of things that we have in Matthew and Luke and other New Testament sources. There could still be material embedded there that reflects either historical knowledge or another way of interpreting what had happened that may help us fill in our picture a bit more robustly.
Some scholars, like the late Burton Mack, think that Q was written in several redactional layers. And to that end, I'd like to ask about, is it possible, actually, let me rephrase that. Is there any indications of strong probability that Q itself, or either was written by somebody that knew Jesus or used sources closer to authentic sayings of Jesus, if not texts that contained authentic sayings of Jesus themselves, that were written by people that knew Jesus?
Yeah, I think one reason why they developed those criteria of authenticity that we talked about earlier uh, is that Jesus is someone about whom claims have been made, divinity, exalted status, other things that are outside of the purview of history, but also seem to clearly rewrite the history and overlay something
Right.
onto this historical figure who did not understand himself in the terms that later creeds depict. And because of that, and because of that awareness that there's a religious bias that may invent things or overlay things, what historians have usually tried to do is to get behind that. And there's an importance to that, and it's really helped us hone some of our methods and our approaches. But there's also a problem there in as much as Jesus probably understood himself theologically, shall we say,
Hmm.
right? Whether maybe not as divine, but as either as possibly the Davidic Messiah or not, either as a figure like Elisha or not, in some way that would have brought God into the picture in terms of how he understood himself. And so some of that theologizing probably reflects the influence of Jesus' own theologizing, even if the church is doing it in a new way after the crucifixion. And so all of that to say that if we had things as early as we have from sources close to any other historical figure, historians would say, unless it really looks like it's made up, it's probably authentic. And I think it would be very interesting to try to do more historical Jesus work in that more mainstream historical way, because there's this constant tension between religious believers who are being insufficiently critical and the not necessarily those who are antagonistic to religion, but who are opposed to this lack of critical method and this naivete and this gullibility on this end, but sometimes then move to the opposite pole. And it distorts this field in a way that you don't get if it's just some other historical figure that, people are interested, but not with the same kinds of axes to grind. So I think that all that to say that I think that the early sources genuinely had an interest in preserving stuff that Jesus said, right? They were not above making stuff up, but they did want to preserve the things that they remembered him having said. And if we don't have, if the result of our critical method is such that nothing is likely to have been authentic, then we're probably erring too far in the direction of skepticism, further than would be justified in the case of any other figure. And I'm not sure that there's definitely bias in our earliest sources, but I'm not sure it's such that it should lead us to think that they've somehow conspired to completely rewrite this figure and reinvent him. Already at the earliest stage, they're dealing with material that's awkward in terms of how they've come to understand him. And at least some of that, I think, is got to be authentic, or at least is more probably authentic than inauthentic, which is the most we can say.
Why do you think that Mark portrays Jesus as being a secret Messiah, a hidden Messiah that doesn't want the public to know who he really is?
Yeah. So one possibility is that he didn't say he was the Messiah. This is, part of the earliest proposal of a so-called messianic secret in the gospel. And that others said it about him and want to explain why he didn't, they hadn't heard him saying it himself. It is entirely historically plausible, though, that Jesus, even if he thought this about himself, either didn't want everybody saying this, or, and I think this is really plausible in light of my John the Baptist research, he was influenced by the death of John to rethink what his own role would be. Right? He may have believed himself to be the one who is to come, the stronger one who would rise from among John's disciples, but may have thought that it's going to be the death of, maybe he thought of the two messiahs, right? The sort of priestly Messiah and then the royal Messiah, who are willing to suffer and willing to undergo rejection. That will motivate God to intervene and bring in the kingdom. And that's why he's so confident that it will happen within the lifetime of some who've heard him. If Jesus didn't have some of those things in which he says, you can only get there by humility and letting God be the one who elevates you, then I think it would be just another failed messianic movement, just like all the others. Right? I think there must have been something along those lines to account for how Christians could then say he could still be the Messiah. Right? If there was nothing there, if it was just another, if he was a revolutionary, leading people in arms, then his death would be the end of the movement. In most cases, we see that. The exceptions are ones where the figure was different from that particular paradigm.
I'd like to now shift to the Gospel of John, because many have noted that the Gospel of John is so different from the Synoptics. And some would like, well, there is historical evidence of Jesus. Let me rephrase that. There is reliable evidence of the reliable data regarding the historical Jesus in the Gospel of John. However, many will say, "Oh, John portrays Jesus as being so theologically advanced. It kind of says he's God, almost says it. Some say, oh, well, it kind of doesn't really say it. Kind of a huge tug of war there." But what do you think about the Gospel of John? Is it so fantastical that we can't reconstruct Jesus at all with it, or is there something more to it than that?
Oh, that's a great question. And that actually, I wrote my doctoral dissertation, and which became my first book, precisely to try to make sense of that, because I'd come through a tradition that had, I don't know that it ever said explicitly, the four Gospels are in the New Testament. They've all got to be on the same page. But that was the impression I was given. And looking closely at John in a course on John, at the university level course on John, like, no, it's different. But why is it different?
Right.
And I think part of it is that it reflects the ongoing debates about who Jesus is. And so I think one of the things that it definitely distorts John's portrait vis-a-vis the historical Jesus is that John is taking the exalted status that Christians come to believe that Jesus holds after he is obedient unto death, even death on a cross, to quote Philippians, and saying that that was his sort of eternal status, right? And this is just sort of an interlude in which he's being surprisingly humble, given that he's the Word made flesh, something like that. Which doesn't mean that he himself is God, right? There's still this humility. The Son does nothing of himself. He does only what he sees his Father doing. And so we're still dealing with a human being, but one who is inspired, taken over, filled with, or embodies, or however one wants to put it. And any of that language risks anachronism. But the word, God's word, God's communication, God's spirit is there and is present in a way that doesn't compare to anyone else in history. And that's what John is claiming. Coming back to John the Baptist again, the Gospel of John has not just the same interest that maybe Luke has, in how John and Jesus relate to each other, but has different kinds of material. Has explicit mention of John and Jesus being active at the same time. So that famous incident in the temple where Jesus drives out the money changers and the animals is before John has been put in prison. And so a historian, I think, could say this is Jesus as part of John's movement doing something at the behest of John the Baptist. And that very fact, the fact that there's this sense that Jesus is part of that movement, so much so that narrative and dialogue has to be invented in order to try to have the Baptists say in an unhistorical way, yeah, no, yep, everyone should be paying attention to him, not to me. I think that's reading back the later tensions between followers of John the Baptist who didn't become Christians and the Christians who are like, we want to keep the Baptists, but Jesus is, is greater. And they're reading that back, but I think we can learn a lot about John and Jesus and then the movements that they sparked, which helps us understand them as historical figures by looking at that material. And I think at the very least, the concurrent activity with John as the one who is the driving force behind it is probably historical. Right? And there are other things like that in the Gospel of John as well.
Did John have unique sources to his text? I know that not all scholars believe this to be the case, but did it have some kind of sign source, or maybe even a separate Jesus saying source, or an earlier, I don't know, proto-Johannine passion narrative that caused it to diverge so much from the synoptic triple agreement?
Yes. So I think the two main suggestions are that John is deliberately trying to be different because he knows the other Gospels, or
Right.
he's different because he's writing independently. And there are scholars who are very, very convinced one way or the other. I'm open to, I still think John is different enough that in ways that don't reflect direct knowledge, that I don't think at the very least, I don't think he's writing with the other Gospels sort of ready to hand and that level of familiarity. But the fact that there are other Gospels complicates things, right? Because then how do we detect what John is getting from here, from there? The story of the paralyzed man seems like it could be a variant of the story in Mark and in the Synoptics where they lower the man through the roof, because the expression is almost the same, where he says, "Rise, take up your mat, and go." And so, is that John reworking it, or has the story changed through a process of oral transmission along the way? And it's so hard to tell. I do think that there's reason to suspect that John had some distinctive sources. We have dialogues that have some of the same characteristics, but just in certain places, right? So, talking with Nicodemus, born anothen, right, which can mean from above or again. Nicodemus understands it in the literal way. Jesus is like, no, I'm talking about something spiritual. Then in the next chapter, you have conversation with a Samaritan woman, living water. Well, what water? You don't even have a bucket. And no, it's so it's dialogues that have this sort of pattern to them. We don't find that all throughout the gospel, and so one possible explanation is that there was a source where stories were told in this form. Precisely when we don't have those sources and we don't have another text that is likely to have used the same sources, right? We can't do what is done in the case of Q and sort of triangulate, right? And so it's much more hypothetical then.
Right.
The one other thing I'd mention is that there are fragments. I can't remember whether these were among the Oxyrhynchus papyri. I have a feeling it might not be. It might be a different set of papyri, but small fragments, but that overlap a bit with stories that John tells, but also has a kind of a synoptic feel to it. And that could be a reworking of John and be from later, but it might be a very, very small snippet of John's source material. And so there's intriguing stuff like that as well, that those who are looking and just thinking about the canonical Gospels could miss. And so there's other stuff that should be brought into the picture as well.
Do you believe that the Gospel of John was written in unity by one person, or were there additional chapters? Was there major redactions done to the Gospel?
Yeah.
And was it written in, the one more part of the question is, was it written in compositional steps as well?
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to remember which scholar it was who said that, if John had sources, he wrote them all himself, because there's this kind of uniform style. And whose style that is, whether you have a final redactor who's adding some stuff and imitating the style of the source material, or whether the whole thing is sort of rewritten with the final editor's style, we don't have a way of knowing that, really. The fact that we hear from sort of an editor and community in the final chapter that this other person is the source of this, he says he wrote these things down, but we don't know how much of that is what we get in the gospel. And we know his testimony is true, right? And so that's not the author saying, And I'm going to try and make myself more reliable by putting in talk about myself. Um, and so we don't know what exactly that means for the compositional process, but it does divulge at the very least that there is editorial activity. And then there are places where, like, there seems to be continuity running, say, between chapters 5 and 7, and 6 seems to break it, and 6 also seems to be dealing with followers of Jesus that are sort of falling away, and it could be because of later developments. And so there are some awkward junctures and interruptions that also suggest that things have been inserted or moved around at some point. It's much easier to detect that that's the case than to definitively say, and here's what it was like before all of that happened, right? Because that gets much more hypothetical.
I would like to shift to Paul now.
Okay.
Some will say, can't know anything about Jesus when it comes to Paul. Paul's Jesus is so vague. Oh, okay, he had a brother and he was crucified. That's it. And then others will say, actually, we can't even know that from Paul. Paul's Jesus is even vaguer than that. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think there's some truth to that. And I think it's important to note how that actually provides an interesting counterargument to mythicism,
Mm,
because that's easy to miss, right? To say that Paul is talking in such not giving us concrete historical details about. He's not giving us any details, right, of the sort that you'd want either for a historical figure, like who are their parents and what influences growing up or anything, and even the Gospels don't give us that because that's not the stuff of ancient biography. But the kinds of things we get in the Gospels are not, for the most part, in the letters of Paul. But neither is like a huge celestial myth with ascension through multiple layers of the heavens to do heavenly atonement or some other thing, or whatever that a mythicist might say. Well, it's all happening in the celestial realm. And so Paul is writing, right? Whatever your view, Paul is writing to people who already share certain beliefs that can be taken for granted and a certain core of knowledge. And pointing that out, I think, is helpful because it shows that Paul's vagueness, Paul's failure to either give a full length mythological narrative or a full length historical narrative is an issue for mythicism or historicism, and it reflects the letter genre, right? And so then what we do is we say, so what can we deduce about the story that these recipients already knew and that Paul knew they knew? And there we get things like, was crucified, born of a woman, born under the law, just saying, was a human being like others and was Jewish. But that much itself, it's really hard, to transfer some of the things that are said to the celestial realm. And born under the law, born under Torah, that's maybe even harder than crucified, right? It's like the angels get together and do a heavenly crucifixion. Okay, maybe, but how do you get born under Torah in the celestial realm? So we have a paucity of details, but what we have, can actually, flesh things out, if you will.
mm.
Maybe that's the right metaphor to use. A little bit more, right? We get a sense of humility, of the kind of person that Paul perceives Jesus to have been, and things like that are not irrelevant from the perspective of the historian. And occasionally he'll throw in an Aramaic word like Abba when writing to Greek-speaking Christians, and things like that. That word must have been meaningful to them. They must have already heard stories in which that was mentioned. Paul throwing it in and not explaining it, using it in the context of saying, you too have become sons, so you can, have the spirit of sonship whereby you cry out, Abba, Father. They know something that makes that word meaningful to them. And that word also appears in the Gospel of Mark, and Father appears more frequently. And so when we triangulate, right, rather than taking the traditional atomistic approach, when we instead sort of triangulate from our sources back to, what's the point of impact, the thing that created these ripples, that leads us back to, I think, a historical Jesus, and may not tell us as much as we'd love to know, but tells us some significant things.
When it comes to Philippians talking about the descent, well, not the descent, but
Maybe.
sort of, yeah, Jesus is maybe descent.
Yeah.
and becomes a man. Does that kind of remind you of the Gospel of John, the way it starts in the chapter 1 about the Word manifesting in flesh? Does that sound like the Philippians hymn to you at all?
It does, and the question is that us reading the Philippians hymn through the lens of John's prologue,
Hmm.
or is that because there's this shared idea? The Philippians hymn, starts with him being in the form of God, and the key possibilities there are that that means some sort of celestial being, or that he's talking about Jesus as he does elsewhere, like in Romans 5, as the last Adam. So as a counterpart to Adam, he's in the image and likeness of God, but he doesn't grasp at equality with God the way Adam did, and he humbles himself. Therefore, he's exalted and essentially reclaims the exalted status that humanity was supposed to have in the traditional Jewish interpretation of Genesis. And so that's one other possibility that seems to. You know, it, I think that's definitely there. The question is that all that's there?
Right.
When we consider that you also have things like the parables of Enoch, in which the Messiah, who is a human being, but a human being who's destined to rule over all things, may actually be sort of prepared in heaven in order to appear. The possibility that that sort of idea could be at work, because the Gospel of John, one of the things that I still have yet to figure out how to integrate in the Gospel of John is that we have this descent of the Word, which is probably the same as the descent of the Spirit. But then we also have the Son of Man, who, no one's gone up into heaven except the Son of Man who came down from heaven. What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? And so, is that the pre-existent Messiah? Right? And so, how does he relate to the Logos? And I think the Gospel of John is starting to raise some of those issues.
Hmm.
For Paul, it may have just been that he's thinking of the Messiah as having pre-existed in heaven, and so maybe thinking of him as already in that sense a kind of counterpoint to Adam. He's still the last Adam, right? And he doesn't come first; he comes at the end, according to Paul's system. And so I think that whatever we say about the Philippians hymn, we need to take those more. It's poetry, it's kind of not everyday prose, and we need to take Paul's more prosaic statements, which sometimes are clearer, and use them to tell us what he really thought there.
And I'd like to shift back to the passion narrative. So we have Mark as the first gospel, which is followed by Matthew and Luke, both in which don't use each other, but they do use Mark as a source. Does the triple agreements between the texts, although it is formed by Matthew and Luke using Mark, could it also indicate, depending on the text that we're talking about within these gospels, that aspects of the passion narrative could go back to historical Jesus at all, not just through obviously Q using Matthew, Luke used Q, not necessarily Mark, but uh, Mark didn't use Q unless you believe in the free source hypothesis, but that's another matter. The I'm talking about different sources, like perhaps is there any indicator that the synoptics had a common source that may have, even in slight ways, have furnished their understanding of the passion there?
Yeah. So the question of whether there, it that I still hope that there'll be some more work done now that we have computer tools that can maybe analyze things in a way that's less subjective than humans looking at text. There's no way we can recognize style, right? Other than maybe doing, calculating the total numbers of occurrences of words, things like that. But AI can detect patterns in language at a level that we cannot, right? That's why we have things like ChatGPT that are not sentient and are not intelligent, but just by going with the patterns that appear in language, from the snapshot of the internet, can produce what sounds like human text and human interaction. And so it's already been shown that studies looking at things like questions of authorship and differences of style, there's some usefulness of AI tools in that regard if we have enough of a data set. Whether AI analysis could give us an indication that, okay, so here there's something other than Mark, right, that's influencing Matthew and Luke, right? And some of it's stuff that the human eye might not pick up on because it's here and then it's quite a bit later, and it's quite a bit later, and it's subtle. And in order to notice it, you have to, and so there's some real hope that we might make some interesting progress if some
Hmm.
people who also have some computer science abilities turn their attention to these things. It's from my perspective as a human with who has not yet developed those tools and does not have access to ones that others have developed that I can use to that purpose. I'm not sure I could tell the difference between another written source and oral tradition that's widely circulated. There are things in the Passion narrative that historians are doubtful of, such as that anyone could hear what Jesus said on the cross, for instance, right? When you're being crucified, it affects your ability to project your voice.
Right.
I think there have even been medical studies that confirm that. So
There we go.
yeah. But that said, there are aspects of it. The, the crucifixion was the most difficult thing for people who believe Jesus was the Messiah to make sense of. This is not supposed to happen if he is God's anointed one. And so it was given a lot of attention, and when they didn't have information, they certainly drew on the scriptures in order to say, okay, and this is fulfilled in this way, things like that. But we also have lots of stories about women who were following and who were there at a distance and things like that. And so we have reason to believe that there were at least some bare bones bits of information. One thing I'd add beyond that is that there's a fact that I think a lot of people miss. It also comes up when people talk about Isaiah 53 in early Christianity, and you get a sense that it's this meaningful suffering, and there's this interpretation, and that's much more of what we're getting in the Passion narratives, right? We're not getting the Mel Gibson blood and gore, right, with all the details of what kind of nails are they, where are the nails going, what shape is this cross implement. Uh, those kinds of details are not the focus, actually. It's these things happen so the scripture might be fulfilled. And that can either mean that they're drawing on scripture in order to create a narrative about Jesus, or that some of the things that they know happened to him, they're looking to the scriptures, trying to make sense of them and say, well, we can explain why this happened, right? I know this is a problem for the messianic claims, but we can show you how this works, right? Just let's turn to the text now. So it's, I think, other than the fact that Jesus was crucified, the looking to the Passion narratives for a lot of other details beyond that, we won't get them, not because they're unreliable, but because they're actually less focused on that than on helping the reader make theological sense of the very fact of the crucifixion.
When you look at the Gospels and you look at John, why do they portray Jesus in certain ways? Sometimes a bit differently. Like sometimes he'll say, "Sell your clothes and buy swords." In other cases, he'll say, "Now don't fight anybody. Be pacifists. Don't fight. It's bad. Love your enemies."
Mm-hmm.
Are we getting different points of view from different church
Yeah.
communities that are perhaps revamping the historical Jesus in the light of their own community's portrayal of Jesus?
Yeah. So the sword sayings are interesting, and at the very least, what we get this statement that I mean, things like whoever lives by the sword will die by the sword, but also anyone who the time is coming when anyone who does not have a sword will need to buy one. Uh, the very fact that he says that suggests that there may be a future shift, but it's not what his movement currently is doing. And I think John Dominic Crossan has made a good case, both for John and Jesus, that these two individuals are each individually dealt with the way Roman law specified to deal with somebody who's an agitator but not leading a violent resistance. Right? When you have a violent resistance, you need to apprehend as many of them as possible. Right? When you have someone who's just a troublemaker and gathering crowds, you get rid of them and expect that will be the end of it. And then keep an eye on things, and the fact that we have Roman source material that says that, and we see it played out in the case of John and Jesus, suggests to me that they're that kind of figure. And Josephus mentions figures like that, and who come in a later time, who I think actually probably reflect the influence of John the Baptist as well. And he says they're as guilty as those revolutionaries because they're creating this sort of apocalyptic fervor that feeds the tensions and the way everything's heading towards this war against Rome that then leads to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And so he says their hands aren't clean either. Uh, he doesn't say as negative things about John and Jesus. And I think the key difference is that these later figures actually led groups of people at a specific time to expect a specific sign. The Mount of Olives will split, or the walls of Jerusalem will fall, or the treasures will be revealed from Mount Gerizim, or things like that. And Jesus talked about the temple being destroyed and rebuilt. So he promised there'd be a sign. It sounds like, but he didn't tell everybody, and we're going to be here, and we're going to occupy this place until it happens, or something like that. And so, I think the sword saying it's really hard to tell where there's some damage control being done and things like that. But the whole tenor of the movement and the very fact that it survives Jesus' execution suggests that it was not focused on Jesus leading armed revolutionaries to. Now, he may have thought that there was a time coming when there would be a final battle, but I think he seems to have believed that he needs to humble himself, right? Just like the person who Moses puts himself forward, and it's like, yeah, he kills an Egyptian, and it's like, yeah, no, you got to get out of here and get to the wilderness and spend time. And then when he's reluctant to go, that's when it's like, okay, he's ready to. I think he may have found this even a basis for this in Scripture. He probably got some of this from John the Baptist and his teaching. And if Jesus wasn't actually like that, I think we'd have trouble explaining the survival of this movement, the fact that people could make sense of it afterwards. I also don't want to read too much into people carrying swords, and there being some room to have self-defense, have a big knife you can use for hunting and food preparation and other things. Yeah, I don't know that everyone who would carry a sword is necessarily thinking of being. Yeah, well, let me put it this way:
Hmm.
we have the conversation at one point in one of the Gospels where it's like, "Hey, we've got two swords here," and Jesus' words are, "That is enough," which either means that's plenty or enough of this. You're not getting where I'm going with this. And either way, right, two swords doesn't make a revolution, right? And so there may have been some room for self-defense and for carrying some things, at least, but that's the most we get a basis for, right? Jesus the revolutionary and some of those ideas, I think the overall evidence really points very strongly in a different direction.
And when you assemble all the data that we have available, what are the most probable things that we know about the historical Jesus?
Yeah, so Jewish man from Galilee. Um, you may notice that this will be a list of things that I don't think people would have made up. So those are the discussed matters of Jewish law and was a teacher. Was renowned as an exorcist. At the very least, had followers who thought he's a Messiah or prophet or all of the above or something important and sent by God in some way. That he carried out a disturbance in the temple, I think, is very likely. That he spoke about it being destroyed and rebuilt in a way that didn't actually happen, so that there's need for damage control, but also sounded like it could be a threat. That he was crucified. Yeah, and that's for somebody 2,000 years ago. It's not a bad list. I do think that when we start looking at individual sayings and things like that, we can add to the list and we can flesh out the portrait even more. But in terms of basics of the life, yeah, let me add to that also. I think part of John the Baptist's movement initially, and probably for as long as John the Baptist was the leader of John the Baptist movement, Jesus was part of it, and afterwards he may have been the first of John's followers who scattered for a bit to then try to regroup that and lead it himself. And so it may be that before we get to the portrait of John as Jesus' precursor. What the sources are indicating to us is that the initial framework was Jesus as potentially John's successor.
Well, thank you for joining me today, James McGrath.
Thank you so much, Jacob. It's always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for being so interested in the stuff that I also think is interesting, and for the chance to share some of these things with a wider audience.
Yep, thank you for joining me today.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.